The Chief Minister told the House he was proud to have already ushered in change and that he now felt it was important to entrench these changes in legislation. Fabian Picardo said he believed the quality of democracy had improved and said that many of the Commission's recommendations had already been introduced and others were in the process. Going through all the recommendations one by one, he advocated to enshrine in legislation that the government should have the power to convene a meeting of the House at short notice, recommending 24 hours. The government did not support a time limit for opposition questions and said supplementaries should be led by subject and relevance. For his part, in response to an incident during the last session of Parliament, when the Speaker did not allow him to ask a supplementary, the opposition leader said politics could not be taken out of question and answers, as this would turn it into a mechanical exercise. Daniel Feetham said there had to be reasonable standards of good behaviour, but that the opposition had to be allowed to do its job. This morning's session appeared interesting and productive, moving away from the usual exchanges.
The mood, I think, is very positive, certainly on the part of the government, and we are delivering that change. It's not just that there's an opportunity for change, it's that change is actually in the process of being delivered. You look at the way that Parliament meets. We now meet once a month. I've called a meeting of Parliament every month, as we said we would, except in August and at Easter, and in the month that we were doing a refurbishment. But we're delivering those changes to the way our democracy works already, and now looking at what further changes the Commission, headed by Mr. Canepa, recommends we should also consider implementing.
Well, I think there is an appetite for change, and I think the mood is one of being constructive and as far as possible trying to move ahead by consensus rather than the government using its majority in order to push some of these reforms through. And I think that is right and proper because these are fundamental reforms that affect, both parties across the floor of the House and indeed the wider community, because it also impacts on the wider community, the way that Parliament works, the rules of Parliament, the enlargement of Parliament, all these things affect not only Parliament but also the wider community. And I think that both sides are going to be trying to move as far as possible on a consensus basis.
The government agreed with the recommendation for a deputy speaker, but said it would be difficult to implement this other than constitutionally. It also supported strengthened legislation for the calling of referendums and that the time period for notice of questions and notice of meetings be increased. It did not agree that Gibraltar needed an electoral commission, especially if the returning officer was given more powers. As to the bill's procedure, Fabian Picardo said MPs worked well together on this. On electoral reform, the government also stated its preference that voting eligibility should continue to be based on residency, with a special caveat for students abroad. For the opposition leader, enlargement of the House was the biggest issue for his party and critical to the process. The government does not seem to agree.
Although the leader of the opposition has chosen to make that a centerpiece, so to speak, of what he's said, the Commission itself has not made a recommendation that there should be an enlargement of the House. And I think most people don't want to see more politicians involved in the day-to-day. We'll consider these issues very carefully, as we are doing. But look, the opposition has demonstrated that they can have a backbencher already with the number of members that they have in the Parliament. And we have demonstrated, unfortunately, as a result of the tragic consequences that led us to lose Charles, that we can run the government with 9 ministers, not 10. So there's room already with 17 members of the House for 2 backbenchers easily, one on the government side and one on the opposition side. It doesn't require us to enlarge the Parliament.
Do you think it'll be an obstacle between you?
Not at all. I think that everybody is looking at the recommendations on an individual basis. We certainly are. We are going to progress those that we think need to be progressed and not progress those that don't need to be progressed. My attitude is to listen to the opposition arguments, and if they put an argument that we have not considered or that we see more merit in now that they've advanced it, we will happily work with them on this issue. This is not about my government or the GSLP or the Liberals. This is about parliamentary reform for the next 30 or 40 years for our community, and I'm approaching it from the point of view of delivering the right and modern change for our people, not simply delivering on our agenda.
About 90% of what the Chief Minister said this morning we agree with in relation to the recommendations that he is prepared to commit his party to taking forward. Where there is a difference, it might be a difference in terms of emphasis or alternatively we may agree with some recommendations, whereas the government doesn't agree with those recommendations. The creation, for example, of an office for opposition members. That's something that we agree with, the government doesn't agree, but those are minor issues. I think that it's possible, and I'm very hopeful, that we will proceed on some form of agreement, consensus position. The real, and I emphasize, the real issue where there might be disagreement, but we're not going to allow it to scupper progress on a consensus basis in relation to the rest of the report, is in relation to enlargement. And, we feel that's fundamental for the improvement of democracy, because what we're really doing by not enlarging Parliament and introducing backbenchers is, amongst other things, excluding from the parliamentary process the leaders of many of our industries in Gibraltar who, for example, may be prepared to give of the time to be backbenchers, to participate in debates, but perhaps don't want to commit to being a full-time government minister or indeed a full-time shadow minister. And I think that having backbenchers and having those kinds of people, indeed also single mothers or mothers of children who may not be able to commit the amount of time full-time to being government ministers or shadow ministers, by excluding those people, we're doing a disservice to democracy, and the contrary is also true. By including them, we enrich democracy and we enrich debate.
Mr. Feetham said the community had outgrown the outdated architecture designed for a legislative assembly. He said the challenge was to reflect the modern constitution, with the reforms a natural progression from it. Finally, he recommended that no one serve more than 2 terms as Chief Minister. Parliament also heard addresses from the Deputy Chief Minister and opposition members. There's unanimity that the debate be picked up by a select committee.
We'll look at the detail of how to make these recommendations a reality, how to implement the recommendations that we accept should be progressed. I think it's very easy to talk in principle about subjects, but then when you look at the nitty-gritty of how a particular section of the Parliament Act needs to change, or how a particular standing order needs to change, that is almost a legal, political argument that needs to be had about the words to be used, and that's not appropriate to be done across the floor of the House. It has to be done without the glare of publicity on members as we look at the detail of how to implement the appropriate recommendations.
The reforms will be returned to the House, with the government expecting the exercise to be completed within 6 months.